1854, Tennessee. After the wedding night, no bride survived. The horrifying story happens in the Gideon family. In the dense forests of Fairmont County, Tennessee, the Hargrove Manor stood starkly by the Blackwater River, a specter among the ancient oak trees. From a distance, it resembled a forgotten castle, with its somber gray granite walls and small turrets rising like watchful eyes. But to the local townspeople, this place was more than just a pile of old stones. It was a dark secret, a frightening whisper passed down from one generation to the next. From 1838 to 1854, more than 40 young women passed through the heavy iron gates of the Hargrove Manor, each promised in marriage to one of the family's 3 sons, Gideon, Caleb, and Ezra. They arrived with dreams of a stable, respectable life, but not a single one was ever seen leaving. For decades, the story of the Hargrove family existed only as a vague warning in Fairmont, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters, a morbid curiosity whispered in the shadowed corners of taverns. But in 1879, when a group of builders repairing the town's old warehouse discovered a locked chest, those whispers turned into horrifying truth. Inside the chest were journals, letters, and forged certificates, records so terrible that historians initially hesitated to make them public. What the documents revealed was not merely a series of family tragedies or unexplained disappearances. They exposed a methodical system of crime, a tightly organized human trafficking network that, under the guise of respectable marriages, had operated in plain sight of the community for over 15 years. Now, let us step together into the shadows of the Hargrove Manor and uncover the crimes recorded in that chest, about a family that turned love into a trap and trust into shackles. The Hargrove Manor was built in 1836 by Jeremiah Hargrove, a man of severe but cunning demeanor. In public, he was a paragon of piety, present at the Fairmont Protestant Church every Sunday, Bible in hand, his voice a low rumble during prayer. However, it was noted that he always left immediately after the service, avoiding the social pleasantries that were a staple of town life. His wife, Abigail, was a faded, gaunt figure, with eyes that always looked to the ground, who rarely left the manor. They had 3 sons, Gideon, Caleb, and Ezra. All were unmarried men, an unusual circumstance in a society where men were expected to marry early to secure their lineage. By 1838, the eldest, Gideon, was 32, while the youngest, Ezra, was already 26. Their prolonged bachelorhood became a topic of gossip, but it was also the key to the family's dark design. Yet, each brother insisted with practiced charm that they were still searching for the perfect life partner. That search became the family's signature story. Each brother was known to disappear for months at a time, claiming business in Savannah, Mobile, or Natchez. Upon their return, they would speak with carefully measured enthusiasm about the women they had met. Always women from outside Fairmont County, always women of modest backgrounds, and, strangely, always women without strong family ties who might object to a hasty marriage. The Hargrove Manor itself encouraged secrecy. Unlike other grand plantation homes, it was built like a fortress, with thick walls, narrow windows, and long corridors leading to rooms secured with iron locks. Situated 3 miles from the main road, the manor was surrounded by dense forest and a small creek, making access difficult. Even the manor's enslaved people were kept at a distance. Only 8 slaves lived on the sprawling 2,500-acre property, an unusually small number, and they were kept in quarters far from the main house. The domestic work was handled by 2 white overseers, Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, both strangers to Fairmont, who had appeared around the same time the Hargrove family arrived. Amos Tate claimed to be a former sailor from Mobile, but no one could verify his story. Virgil Boone, with his stocky build and cold, sharp eyes, often carried a dagger, which kept the local townspeople at a distance. Both were fiercely loyal to the Hargrove family, and their presence raised questions that no one dared to ask aloud. In those early years, the Hargroves presented themselves as model planters. They contributed to the building of bridges and roads, funded the church, and settled their cotton accounts on time with merchants in Savannah and New Orleans. On the surface, they were eccentric, but respectable, distant, yes, but successful. Still, certain details stood out. The brothers were rarely seen together, each maintaining a staggered schedule of absences. They spoke often of potential brides but never sought matchmaking help from the matrons of Fairmont, who prided themselves on arranging marriages for the region's sons and daughters. And while other planters opened their homes for balls, dinners, and harvest festivals, the Hargroves hosted nothing. Their manor was a closed world, and those who ventured too close often left with a sense of unease. One neighbor, Hannah Gray, whose farm sat on a ridge overlooking the Hargrove Manor, later wrote in her diary that she felt something unnatural about the family's routines. Lanterns at odd hours, she recorded, moving not like people celebrating, but like men laboring with a dark purpose. Before long, her suspicions would take the shape of tragedy, because in October of 1838, the eldest son, Gideon Hargrove, announced his engagement to Mary Caldwell, a 20-year-old woman from Natchez, Mississippi. She would be the first of more than 40 brides to enter the Hargrove Manor and never emerge. The year was 1838, and Fairmont County, like much of the South, was thriving on cotton. Wealthy planters expanded their lands with the confidence of men who believed the prosperity of King Cotton would never fade. It was in this atmosphere of booming wealth that the Hargrove family flourished. Their land stretched 2,500 acres along the bends of the Blackwater River, which not only nourished the cotton fields but also connected the manor to broader trade networks, a fact Jeremiah Hargrove always emphasized. The manor, he would say, was perfectly situated for commerce and for quiet. The neighbors soon learned just how much the Hargroves valued that quiet. Unlike other planters who flaunted their wealth in splendid mansions, the Hargrove home was built more like a fortress than a house. Its unusual wings could be sealed off with heavy doors. Some rooms had no windows at all, accessible only through iron-banded oak thresholds. Visitors noted how their footsteps echoed strangely in the halls, as if the house were designed not for welcome, but for confinement. Jeremiah himself remained a reserved figure, stiffly polite but cold, a man who listened more than he spoke. Abigail, his wife, seemed to hover in the background like a shadow. She attended church but rarely spoke, her hands trembling when questioned too closely. The sons, Gideon, Caleb, and Ezra, handled most of the family's business dealings. They were disciplined, efficient, and strangely detached from the social rituals expected of men their age. In his 20s, a planter's son was meant to court, marry, and secure an heir. In his 30s, he was expected to be a leader in local politics, but the Hargrove brothers had little interest in any of that. Their preoccupations were always elsewhere, on trips to Mobile, Savannah, or Natchez. When pressed about their single status, they would smile dismissively. "We are searching for perfect partners," they would say, "and such unions take time." That explanation seemed plausible enough until October 1838, when Gideon Hargrove returned from Natchez with the announcement that he had found his bride. Her name was Mary Caldwell, 20 years old, orphaned by a fire and living on the charity of a distant aunt. Left with debts and a bleak future, she worked as a seamstress to get by. Gideon claimed he had met her at a fair in Natchez, drawn to her gentle nature and her faith. She had no siblings, no close protectors, and virtually no prospects. To Gideon, he said, she was perfect. The wedding was arranged with unusual secrecy. Gideon explained to the neighbors that Mary was of a delicate constitution and easily overwhelmed by crowds. For her sake, the ceremony would be private, attended only by family. A larger celebration would follow once she had settled into her new life. To most, this explanation seemed reasonable. Southern society had long indulged the notion that women were fragile creatures who needed protection from overstimulation. On an October evening in 1838, a carriage rolled up to the Hargrove Manor. Unlike the polished coaches that usually carried brides, this one was covered with a thick canvas that obscured everything inside. It was driven not by a family member, but by Amos Tate, one of the overseers. A few neighbors recalled seeing the carriage pass, noting its silence, its anonymity, the way the dust rose behind its wheels in the fading light. For the next 3 days, the Hargrove Manor was sealed. No visitors were admitted, no music carried across the fields. Instead, there were lanterns, strange lights moving between the main house and the riverside warehouse at hours when decent families were asleep. Hannah Gray, from her ridge, wrote in her diary, that she heard a sound like a choked sob carried on the night air and the creak of wagon wheels long before dawn. When Gideon next appeared in town, his demeanor was that of a newlywed, but when asked about Mary, his words grew grave. She had, he explained, come down with a sudden fever during the journey and remained bedridden. She could not bear visitors, not even the attention of a doctor. She begged for privacy, and Gideon, as a loving husband, had granted it. Dr. Samuel Vance, the only physician in the area, was unsettled. He offered to call on the bride, but Gideon refused flatly, citing Mary's fear of male doctors. Instead, he said they were seeking advice from specialists in Nashville by correspondence. Weeks passed, and the supposed fever grew worse. Then came news that Mary had suffered a fall while walking in the garden, which had weakened her further. By November, Gideon confided to a few concerned neighbors that his wife's condition had become hopeless. By December, Mary Caldwell was gone. There was no funeral. No grave was marked in Fairmont County. Gideon simply informed acquaintances that she had succumbed to her illness and, per her wishes, had been laid to rest quietly beside her relatives in Natchez. But no one in Natchez remembered such a burial. In fact, few remembered Mary at all once Gideon's story was scrutinized. There were no church records of their marriage. No official certificate had been filed with Fairmont County. There was only Gideon's word, supported by a letter of questionable origin from a Methodist minister in Natchez whose name appeared in no church ledgers. Hannah Gray, watching from her ridge, kept her journal. They say the young bride died of a fever, but what fever makes the sound of wagon wheels in the night? What fever requires chains to be delivered under a canvas? What fever brings a man's lantern back from the riverside warehouse at dawn with nothing? Mary Caldwell had become the first of many names to vanish into the silence of the Hargrove Manor, and though the neighbors whispered uneasily, the explanations fragile health, sudden fevers, the supposed modest wishes of the young brides were enough to keep questions from becoming accusations. For now, the winter of 1839 passed quietly in Fairmont County. Cotton profits filled the ledgers of the planters, and the Hargrove Manor continued its steady trade with merchants in Savannah and New Orleans. But beneath the surface of prosperity, a strange silence had fallen. The neighbors who had congratulated Gideon Hargrove on his marriage now whispered uneasily, for no one had ever seen his bride. By December, word spread that Mary Caldwell was dead, taken by an illness that no one outside the Hargrove family had witnessed. Yet, most swallowed their doubts. Tragedy, after all, was common in those years. It was easier to nod politely than to accuse one of the county's wealthiest families of deception. It was easier to accept Gideon's solemn demeanor and the family's insistence on privacy. But just a year later, the pattern repeated itself. In the spring of 1840, Caleb Hargrove, the second son, returned from a long trip to Mobile. He brought news that startled even the most cynical neighbors. He too was to be married. His bride's name was Sarah Tillman, and one 8-year-old girl, orphaned after a steamboat accident, claimed her father's life. Her mother had died years before. Sarah, Caleb explained, was alone in the world, vulnerable, hard-working, and pious. She is not like the pampered daughters of wealthy families, Caleb told a merchant friend in town. She has known hardship. She understands duty. She will bring strength to our name. Again, the story seemed plausible enough. In the antebellum South, young women without family often had few options. For someone like Sarah, the promise of marriage to a wealthy, landed man would have been a salvation. On a humid May evening, the same carriage, covered in canvas and driven by Amos Tate, rumbled up to the Hargrove Manor. No neighbors were invited to the ceremony. No church bells rang, only silence, broken by the sound of horses crossing the wooden bridge that led to the plantation's private road. For 3 nights, the manor was ablaze with light. Lanterns traced paths between the main house and the riverside warehouse. Hannah Gray, ever watchful from her ridge, noted that the activity seemed more intense than it had been for Mary Caldwell's arrival. She claimed to have heard low voices, hurried footsteps, and what she described as faint cries quickly swallowed by the night. When Caleb next appeared in town, he wore the face of a burdened man. His bride, he explained, had fallen ill shortly after her arrival. She had contracted a fever, strangely similar to the one that had afflicted Mary, and was confined to her bed. "She is so fragile," Caleb said softly. The journey was too much for her. Dr. Samuel Vance offered his help again, and again he was refused. This time, Caleb claimed Sarah had a deep fear of doctors and begged for privacy. The weeks passed, and Caleb provided updates in carefully rehearsed tones. The fever lingered. She had tried to stand and had fallen. Complications had set in. By the end of summer, the inevitable conclusion was announced. Sarah Tillman, too, was dead. No funeral was held. No grave was marked. Instead, Caleb told acquaintances that her remains had been quietly transported to Mobile to be buried near where her father had died. By now, the whispers in Fairmont were growing louder. 2 brides, both vanished within months of their arrival. 2 deaths, both explained by vague fevers. 2 funerals, both conducted far from the county where anyone could bear witness. Some neighbors brushed off the unease. Unfortunate coincidences, they said. Others were not so easily placated. Among them was Reverend Daniel Holt, the pastor of the Fairmont Protestant Church. He prided himself on keeping meticulous records of every wedding and funeral in the county. When he tried to find entries for Gideon's and Caleb's weddings, he found nothing. Inquiries sent to Natchez and Mobile were met with silence. No ministers there remembered officiating for the Hargrove sons. No churches had records of the ceremonies. When Jeremiah Hargrove was pressed for an explanation, he produced sealed letters from ministers in distant towns, claiming the services had been held privately at the bride's requests. Yet, the language of the letters seemed stilted, the seals poorly struck, and the signatures unfamiliar. To Reverend Holt, they smelled of forgery. Meanwhile, Hannah Gray continued her private vigil. Her diary entries from that year are filled with careful notes on lights, movements, and sounds from across the river. She wrote of wagons arriving at midnight, of crates being carried into the warehouse, of figures moving swiftly along the riverbank. She also wrote of the enslaved people on the manor, who seemed fearful, huddling near their quarters at night and refusing to go near the river. "Even the slaves shun the house," she recorded. "They know something we do not, something terrible." Dr. Vance, frustrated at being shut out, began keeping his own records. He noted the Hargroves' refusals, their evasions, the absence of any medical consultation. To him, the pattern was unmistakable. Young women, always without strong family ties, were brought to the manor, isolated, declared ill, and then vanished. By the end of 1840, the suspicions in Fairmont were no longer just whispers. They were spoken in churchyards, at market stalls, in hushed tones around hearths. Yet, despite the unease, no one dared to openly confront the Hargroves. Their wealth, their connections, and their carefully maintained veneer of piety shielded them. It was easier to look away, easier to hope that mere misfortune had cursed the Hargrove family than to believe something darker lurked within its stone walls. But for those who watched closely, for Reverend Holt, for Dr. Vance, and especially for Hannah Gray, the shape of a pattern was emerging, and within that pattern lay a horror that would only grow clearer with each vanished bride. By 1842, the Hargrove family, by their own account, had lost 2 daughters-in-law in less than 4 years. For most communities, such misfortune would have marked a family for pity, perhaps even suspicion. Yet, in Fairmont County, the Hargroves remained strangely untouched. They continued their cotton trade, attended Sunday services with rigid punctuality, and contributed generously to local causes. Their quiet charity, funding a bridge repair, donating to the church, seemed to quell criticism before it could form. But silence could not erase the unease. For those who watched closely, the pattern was becoming undeniable. And when the 3rd bride arrived, suspicion began to solidify into fear. In the summer of 1842, Ezra Hargrove, the youngest son, announced he had found his match. Her name was Laura Bennett, a 19-year-old from Savannah, Georgia. Ezra told a familiar story. Laura was newly orphaned, her father a fallen soldier, her mother long dead from illness. She had no close relatives to protect her, no property to sustain her, no guardian but Ezra himself. She was modest, he said, hard-working and virtuous. A woman who understands hardship, he told another planter. A woman who deserves security. The carriage that brought Laura to the plantation was the same as always, canvas-covered, anonymous, arriving at dusk. Amos Tate drove, his shoulders hunched, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, the wheels rattling over the wooden bridge, carrying another bride into the shadows of the Hargrove Manor. This time, however, the activity at the house seemed different. Hannah Gray, now suspicious enough to keep meticulous notes, recorded in her diary the arrival of wagons in the days leading up to Laura's appearance. They came at night, carrying canvas-shrouded crates. From her ridge, Hannah thought she saw the glint of iron chains, the bulky shape of timber, and the outline of tools. On the night of Laura's supposed wedding, Hannah described something more terrifying. The lanterns moved not in celebration, she wrote, but in labor. The riverside warehouse was lit until dawn, and I heard voices, not joyful, but tense, commanding, urgent, and once a scream, sharp and choked, cut off as suddenly as a bird silenced mid-song. The next morning, a wagon left the plantation, its wheels heavy, its driver glancing over his shoulder more often than ahead. When Ezra reappeared in town a week later, he wore the familiar mask of concern. His bride, he explained, had taken ill almost immediately. She was bedridden, feverish, unable to receive visitors. The story echoed Gideon's words about Mary Caldwell and Caleb's claims about Sarah Tillman. And once again, no doctor was summoned. By August, Ezra's updates grew grim. Laura was weakening. She had collapsed while trying to walk. Her condition was beyond saving. By September, she was dead, buried, Ezra claimed, in Savannah with her relatives. But when Reverend Daniel Holt made inquiries with clergymen in Savannah, no one could confirm her burial. No one remembered officiating her funeral. Once again, the trail dissolved into silence. Meanwhile, the enslaved people of the Hargrove Manor began to behave in ways that drew notice. A neighboring farmer recalled that they rarely left their quarters after sunset. Even when their duties required work in the fields or gardens, they resisted going near the riverside warehouse. They huddled together at night, he later told investigators, as if they feared what might emerge from the shadows. Hannah's notes echoed this observation. She wrote of seeing the enslaved women gathering their children indoors before the sun went down, whispering prayers under their breath. She saw the men refuse to carry tools near the river, even under threat of punishment. Their fear was palpable, though its cause remained unspoken. On one evening late in September, Hannah claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary. From her ridge, she saw a group of men moving toward the river dock, carrying what looked like sacks or bundles. But the bundles moved, she insisted, as if they were alive. Two men, Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, loaded them onto a flatboat moored at the bank. The boat pushed off silently, guided by men whose voices carried across the water in a language Hannah did not recognize. Within an hour, the boat was gone, swallowed by the bends of the Blackwater River. Dr. Samuel Vance grew increasingly alarmed. In his own notebook, he recorded a third wife, again unseen by anyone outside the family. Again, the excuse was fever, feminine weakness, fragile nerves, no burial, no ceremony, no proof. Each time the pattern repeats itself with an eerie precision. I fear there is a design behind this, a design too dark to name aloud. But like Hannah, Dr. Vance lacked proof, and in Fairmont County, an accusation without proof could mean ruin. The Hargroves were wealthy, respected, and feared. Their influence extended to the courthouse, the church, even the sheriff's office. No one wanted to be the first to speak what many were beginning to suspect. So Laura Bennett's name sank into the silence, like Mary Caldwell's and Sarah Tillman's before her. Another young woman vanished. Another widower went about his business as if unburdened by grief. In retrospect, it is remarkable how well the Hargroves understood the weaknesses of their era. They targeted women without family, whose disappearances would cause little outcry. They cloaked their actions in the language of modesty and fragility, exploiting the societal belief that young brides were too delicate to be scrutinized. They played their parts with such careful precision that suspicion, even when voiced, could find no footing. But for Hannah Gray, the evidence was piling up. In her diary, she wrote, "This is not misfortune, not fever, not a curse. It is a pattern methodically repeated. If we turn away, there will be more, and the river will carry them away as it has the others." Hannah was right. The disappearances were not accidents, not tragedies. They were part of something deliberate, calculated, and far larger than anyone in Fairmont then realized. By the 1,840 seconds, the rumors surrounding the Hargrove family had become too persistent to ignore. 3 brides had vanished, each disappearing behind the iron gates of the stone house, each explained away by fever, frailty, or sudden death. Yet the brothers remained in town, conducting their business with the faces of men untouched by grief. Their cotton yields were steady, their accounts with merchants flawless. They continued to donate to town projects. To the casual observer, they looked less like a cursed family and more like unusually fortunate planters, save for the whispered matter of their missing wives. Yet, no formal inquiry took place. No sheriff rode up the Hargrove Drive to demand answers. Those who considered it quickly thought better. Jeremiah Hargrove's connections were extensive, and his 2 overseers, Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, were not men to be trifled with. And so the silence deepened, even as suspicion gnawed at the edges. It was in 1844 that the pattern repeated itself with new refinements. This time, the bride belonged to the eldest son, Gideon Hargrove, in his second marriage. Her name was Eleanor Vance, 22 years old, from a small town in Kentucky. Her father, a small farmer, had died of influenza, leaving the family in debt. Eleanor, as the eldest, felt herself a burden. Gideon had met her on a trip north, or so the story went. He described her as strong, capable, and desperate to escape poverty. She deserves more than charity, Gideon insisted. She deserves a home and a husband who will honor her. Again, the story fit the Hargroves' established script perfectly. A woman who was vulnerable, alone, grateful for rescue. The night Eleanor arrived, Hannah Gray watched closely. By now, she was familiar with the rhythm. The covered carriage rolling in at dusk, the grim faces of the overseers, the sealed house. But this time, her diary recorded something new. For weeks before Eleanor's appearance, wagons had come and gone under cover of darkness. Their cargo was unlike anything she had seen before: timber, iron fittings, and what looked unmistakably like shackles. Hannah described men laboring near the riverside warehouse, their lanterns flickering. She believed they were digging. "The ground near the river is disturbed," she wrote, "and stones are being carried away. I see timbers being lowered into the earth. It is as if they are building a cellar right beneath the warehouse." Her suspicions proved correct. What the Hargroves were building was no mere storehouse. It was a hidden cellar designed to hold their brides, and perhaps more, before they were sent elsewhere. When Eleanor was brought to the manor, the lights burned for 3 straight nights. From her ridge, Hannah swore she heard voices not just from the house, but from underground, faint, muffled, as if echoing through stone. "Not one, but many," she wrote. The voices of more than one woman, pleading, crying, though never for long before silence fell again. On the 3rd night, a wagon creaked away from the plantation, its wheels heavy, heading for the dock. A boat was waiting, figures moving with practiced efficiency. Within an hour, it, too, was gone. Meanwhile, the community received the familiar script. Gideon spoke with concern of his new bride's fragile health. She had collapsed from exhaustion after the journey, he explained. Then came the inevitable fever. By winter, she too had vanished, buried, according to the story, among her kin in Kentucky. Reverend Daniel Holt, growing weary of the forged papers the Hargroves produced, attempted once more to confirm the burial. No church in Kentucky had a record of it. No minister remembered her name. The letter produced by Jeremiah Hargrove bore the seal of a non-existent church. Still, the town did nothing. Suspicion was not proof, and seeking proof was dangerous. The Hargroves' wealth shielded them. Their overseers intimidated would-be busybodies. And so Eleanor Vance, like those before her, disappeared without a trace. It was during this period that a new voice entered the record. Jacob, an enslaved man occasionally hired out from a neighboring plantation, would later give testimony after escaping north during the Civil War. His words, recorded by Union officers, corroborated what Hannah had long suspected. Jacob described being brought to the Hargrove Manor to haul timber and stone. He recalled being forbidden to speak of the work. He remembered the constant presence of Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, their daggers and pistols never far from hand. And he remembered the underground rooms, stone-lined cells fitted with chains, with drainage grooves cut into the floor to wash away filth. They built a place to hold people, Jacob said, not for animals, not for storage, but for people, women. He told of seeing young women led between the main house and the cellar, pale and stumbling as if drugged, their eyes vacant, their bodies limp. He told of the boats at the dock, of women being carried aboard under cover of darkness. Some moaned faintly, others did not move at all. Jacob's testimony, transcribed years later, confirmed what Hannah had feared but never spoken. The Hargroves were not just cursed with fragile brides, they were holding them, imprisoning them until they could be sent away. By 1845, the pattern was no longer rumor. It was a refined and perfected system. Each brother claimed a territory, Gideon in Mississippi and Kentucky, Caleb in Alabama, Ezra in Georgia. Each returned with a bride who then vanished. The manor's isolation concealed their work, while society's belief in female frailty excused their secrecy. But now, in the shadows of the Blackwater River, a new infrastructure had taken shape. The Hargroves were no longer just hiding their brides, they were processing them, and in that underground cellar, the cries that Hannah heard through the stone marked the beginning of something far larger and darker than anyone in Fairmont then dared to imagine. By 1846, the whispers in Fairmont County had become something heavier, an unease that hung even in the Sunday pews, where the Hargrove brothers bowed their heads in prayer as solemnly as any pious men. No one dared to say it, not in public, but the thought gnawed at them. How many brides could vanish before coincidence became certainty? 4 were gone. Mary Caldwell, Sarah Tillman, Laura Bennett, Eleanor Vance. Each had arrived by carriage at dusk. Each had been confined within the manor's stone walls. Each had disappeared, explained away by the same flimsy script of fever and exhaustion. And now the pattern showed no sign of slowing. In the autumn of 1846, Caleb Hargrove, the second son, announced another engagement, this time to a young woman from Pensacola named Catherine Mills. She, too, fit the profile, perfectly newly orphaned, working in a laundry, with no powerful relatives to interfere. She arrived at the manor in October, 3 days of lights, the silent procession of wagons, voices echoing faintly across the river. By November, she was gone. That winter, Ezra Hargrove returned from Augusta with a bride of his own, Grace Foster, just 19 years old. Her father, a merchant, had died of smallpox, her mother succumbing to grief not long after. Again, she entered the manor by carriage, shrouded in secrecy. Again, within weeks, she had fallen ill. By February, she, too, had vanished. The numbers were climbing rapidly, and though the community still hesitated to act, the strain of the silence was beginning to show. Hannah Gray, ever vigilant, filled her diary with observations so detailed they would later serve as an almost daily log of the manor's activities. She recorded the exact times lanterns moved between the main house and the riverside warehouse. She described the wagons, some carrying timber and crates, others with canvas-shrouded burdens. She even noted the changes in the enslaved people's behavior, their refusal to walk alone after dark, their hurried whispers in the fields. On one night in March of 1847, she wrote, "I heard the cries again, unmistakably human. More than one voice, though faint, as if buried deep. They did not cry for long. The river took a boat that night. I counted 3 figures loaded like cargo, their shapes limp beneath the canvas. My heart trembles to see it." Hannah began to wonder if she herself was in danger. More than once, she saw Virgil Boone, the cold-eyed overseer, staring up at her ridge with narrowed eyes, as if measuring the distance between them. Meanwhile, Dr. Samuel Vance was keeping his own records. His leather-bound notebook, later found among his papers, reveals a mind grappling with suspicion and professional frustration. 6 brides now, he wrote in late 1847, each said to have died of a fever, each denied a physician's care. Their deaths are spoken of but never seen. No graves, no certificates that stand up to scrutiny, only badly forged letters, struck with seals that match no ministers I know. It is impossible that so many unrelated young women should contract the same vague illness in the same family with the same outcome. Dr. Vance went further than before. He began making unannounced visits to the manor, offering medical assistance. Each time he was politely but firmly turned away by the overseers. On one occasion, Amos Tate told him flatly, "The family is in mourning. Your presence would wound their grief." Vance left, but his unease only deepened. By 1848, the count of vanished brides had reached at least 8, yet the Hargroves showed no signs of being widowers. Gideon still conducted business in Natchez with brisk efficiency. Caleb attended fairs in Mobile, purchasing supplies with his usual punctuality. Ezra traveled frequently, speaking of investments and new opportunities. None wore mourning clothes. None withdrew from society as custom demanded. In Southern culture, widowers were expected to wear black, abstain from public entertainments, to carry the demeanor of grief for years. The Hargrove brothers, by contrast, seemed unaffected. They went about their lives with the same cool composure as if their wives had never existed. This discrepancy did not go unnoticed. Reverend Daniel Holt, who had long suspected the forgeries, discreetly raised the issue with trusted colleagues. "They carry no sorrow," he remarked, "only excuses. If they were true widowers, they would bear the weight of their loss. Instead, they continue as if unburdened. I fear their words are not truths, but masks." Hannah's diary from the winter of 1848 is particularly haunting. She described seeing multiple carriages arrive at the manor in a single week, more than she had ever witnessed before. Some carried barrels and boxes, others appeared to carry people. She swore she heard the clank of chains as they passed the warehouse. "They are building something larger," she wrote, "not for one bride, but for many. I fear the cellar beneath the warehouse is no longer empty. There are enough voices to fill it." Her words would later align with the testimony of Jacob, the enslaved man who had labored on the construction. The Hargroves were no longer content to process women one by one. They were creating a system. Cells large enough for multiple captives, drainage to wash away the evidence, ventilation to keep the cries muffled, but the prisoners alive. Yet, despite the mounting evidence in whispers, diaries, and doubts, Fairmont County remained frozen in inaction. To accuse the Hargroves publicly was to risk ruin. Their wealth reached into every corner of the county. Their overseers were known to carry weapons and to watch closely those who asked too many questions. The result was a paralysis. The community knew, but did not act. They suspected, but they did not accuse. And so, throughout the 1,840 seconds, the Hargrove operation continued unimpeded. More brides vanished, more carriages rolled, more boats slipped silently down the Blackwater River. In retrospect, it is clear these years marked the transition from rumor to horror. The first brides might have been dismissed as misfortune, the second as coincidence. But by the time Catherine Mills and Grace Foster joined the list, the pattern was cemented. The Hargroves had perfected their method, and still no one dared to stop them. By the early 1,850 seconds, Fairmont County was a place divided between knowledge and silence. Too many brides had vanished, and the Hargroves still behaved as if nothing unusual had happened. Their ledgers were tidy, their crops thrived, their reputations remained outwardly intact. Yet, in the notebooks of Dr. Samuel Vance and in the diary of Hannah Gray, the shape of the truth had formed. Both suspected the disappearances were not tragedies of fever or fragile nerves. They believed something deliberate was taking place. What they lacked was proof. That proof came from an unexpected source, a man who had lived in the manor's shadow, close enough to hear what others could not. His name was Jacob, an enslaved field hand, hired out seasonally from a neighboring plantation. Jacob was lean, with quick eyes and a familiarity with silence. For silence meant survival. He labored on the Hargrove land often enough to catch glimpses of what most could not. The hidden movements after sunset, the whispered commands of the overseers, the construction of something underground. Jacob would keep his memories to himself for years until he escaped north and shared his testimony with Union officers. But what he described matched every suspicion Hannah and Dr. Vance had recorded. According to Jacob, the wagons Hannah had seen were not carrying farm supplies, as the Hargroves claimed. They carried timber and stone to the riverside warehouse, where men worked by lantern light to build a cellar beneath the foundation. The air was damp, the stone walls thick, the iron fittings heavy enough to restrain grown men. The space was designed not for tools, but for people. They built it to hold women, Jacob later said. Not for a few days, but for weeks. Chains were fixed to the walls. The floor was sloped so water could run through. The doors were bolted thick as a jailhouse gate. He told of hearing muffled voices from below, cries that echoed in the night and were swallowed by the stone. He saw young women being led between the main house and the cellar, pale and stumbling, their steps unsteady. They walked like sleepwalkers, he said, eyes half closed, heads lolling, like they'd been given medicine. The medicine, Jacob learned, was laudanum and opium, administered in careful doses. The women were kept docile, half-conscious, until the boats arrived at the Hargrove dock. Then, under cover of darkness, they were carried aboard like cargo. Jacob described the vessels as flatboats, modified with below-deck compartments, lined with breathing holes. A crew of strange men worked them, men who spoke with accents Jacob could not place. The boats left at midnight, slipping quietly down the Blackwater River, bound for the larger waterways that led to Mobile Bay. From there, Jacob overheard that the women were transferred to ships bound for distant ports, New Orleans, Havana, even across the Atlantic. They talked of women like they were goods, Jacob recalled bitterly. The number, the price, who would pay for which kind, like they was cattle. One memory haunted him more than any other. One night in 1848, Jacob was ordered to haul crates to the warehouse. While resting in the shadows, he overheard Jeremiah Hargrove himself speaking with a visitor. The man was no planter, but a merchant, his accent that of the coast. Jacob could not see him clearly, but he caught fragments of their exchange. 3 more before the month is out, Jeremiah said. 1 for New Orleans, the other 2 for further on. The merchant replied, "Good. The buyers in Havana are expecting a spring shipment. They pay double for youth and fairness. Make sure they arrive intact." It was then that Jacob fully understood. This was not simply a family cursed with fragile brides. This was commerce, a network of human trafficking disguised as marriage. The weddings, the secrecy, the stories of fever and exhaustion. It was nothing more than a cover that allowed the Hargroves to move women undetected under the guise of marriage and sudden illness. Back in Fairmont, of course, no one knew this. Only the whispers persisted alongside the careful notes of Hannah and Dr. Vance. But Jacob's testimony, when it emerged years later, would validate their fears with chilling accuracy. In her diary in the autumn of 1849, Hannah wrote, "I hear more voices now, not one, more than brides. The wagons carry more than chests. I know it. I dare not speak, for the overseers look too often at my ridge. But the cries do not leave me. They come even in my sleep." Her words hinted at what Jacob confirmed. By 1850, the Hargroves were no longer just luring single brides. Their network had expanded. Women, perhaps more than one at a time, were being held in the cellar beneath the warehouse. Dr. Vance continued to politely ask for entry, but the overseers blocked him at every turn. On one occasion in the summer of 1850, he was told by Virgil Boone, "Best you tend to your own patients, Doctor. The Hargroves have all the care they require." Vance wrote later in his notebook, "They guard that house as if it holds treasure. But treasure does not cry in the night. Treasure does not require chains." In retrospect, historians would mark this period as the critical transition. The first brides might have been passed off as tragic misfortunes, their disappearances attributed to the vagaries of health and distance, but by the 1852, the Hargroves had established something far more formidable, a system of holding, transport, and trade. Yet in Fairmont, the silence held. No official inquiry took place. The sheriff, once curious, had suddenly lost interest after an old debt of his was helped by the Hargrove family. The ministers, who had suspected the forged letters, had ceased their inquiries, wary of scandal. The Hargroves had spun a web of fear and influence, wide enough to stifle action, and so the boats continued to leave. The cellar continued to fill, and the brides, over a dozen by then, continued to vanish without a trace. For nearly a decade and a half, the truth remained buried under stone and silence. But in the fall of 1853, a mistake would be made. A bride poorly chosen, a family not so easily silenced. That mistake would shatter the illusion of secrecy and bring the full weight of inquiry to the Hargrove gates. Throughout the long summer of 1853, the Hargrove manor continued its uneasy rhythm. The carriages, the lanterns, the 3 nights of secrecy that always followed the arrival of a new bride. By then, the whispers in Fairmont were no longer whispers, but murmurs exchanged in church pews, muttered in general stores, written cautiously in the diaries of those who feared their own memories. And still, no one dared to confront the family directly. But in the fall of that year, Ezra Hargrove, the youngest of the brothers, made a mistake that would break the silence spectacularly. Her name was Charlotte Weaver, just 17 years old, from Charleston. Her parents had died of yellow fever. Alone and facing destitution, Charlotte had been living under the care of an uncle who considered her a burden. To a girl like her, the promise of marriage to a wealthy planter must have seemed like a salvation. Ezra had met her, or so the story went, while on business in Charleston. He had charmed her with words of land, security, and a family of her own. By October, he announced to the neighbors that he was engaged, repeating the phrases his brothers had rehearsed before him, that Charlotte was gentle, modest, and of a delicate constitution. On an evening in late October 1853, the canvas-covered carriage appeared once more, creaking over the bridge to the Hargrove Manor. Amos Tate drove, his expression grim, while Virgil Boone rode behind, his eyes scanning the shadows. The lanterns flared up again, dancing between the main house and the riverside warehouse. And for 3 nights, as always, the manor was closed to the world. Hannah Gray, ever faithful to her ridge, recorded what she saw. Voices again from underground, more than one. But this time, I swear I heard a girl cry out, "No, no, no," before it was smothered. The sound chilled me so, I could not sleep. I fear they are not brides, but prisoners. What Ezra Hargrove could not have known was that Charlotte Weaver, unlike the others before her, was not entirely alone in the world. She had a brother, William Weaver, an ambitious young lawyer in Charleston with extensive connections. The siblings were close, corresponding regularly. When Charlotte announced her engagement, William had celebrated with her, though he was privately uneasy about the secrecy and haste surrounding it. But when Charlotte left Charleston, her letters stopped. Weeks went by. No word. William wrote again and again, but there was no reply. His unease grew, hardening into fear. William Weaver was not a man to be easily put off. He was a sharp young lawyer with a network that stretched across the South, to Savannah and Nashville. He had seen enough cases to recognize a lie when he heard one. When he heard about the Hargrove family, wealthy, secretive, with a string of brides all said to have died young, his instincts sharpened. No family is that unfortunate, he told himself. If my sister has vanished there, then something is very wrong. While Fairmont shied away from confrontation, William Weaver did not. He began discreet inquiries, writing to colleagues in Tennessee and hiring private investigators in Savannah to trace the supposed marriage. What they found alarmed him deeply. There was no record of Charlotte Weaver's marriage in Charleston. No minister remembered the ceremony. The letter Jeremiah Hargrove had sent to Charlotte's uncle, announcing her death, bore the same irregularities others had noted before. Phrasing that did not match church language, seals struck from dies that appeared to be forgeries. William pushed further. Through merchants he knew in Mobile, he learned that shipments from the Fairmont region often came downriver quietly, loaded at odd hours, bound for Mobile Bay. The manifests were vague: provisions, supplies, household goods, yet the money exchanged was far too large for such simple cargo. Then came the testimony of a sailor who had once worked on a riverboat hired by the Hargroves. Paid in cash and promised safety, he recalled hauling canvas-covered bundles aboard, bundles that moved as if alive, from which he thought he heard muffled cries. He had quit after one trip, unnerved and vowing never to work for the Hargroves again. Back in Fairmont, the townspeople continued their uneasy silence. Ezra Hargrove appeared briefly in town, pale and solemn, reporting that his bride was unwell, suffering from a fever. By December, he announced her death. Buried, he claimed, in Charleston. But William Weaver, still waiting for a letter, refused to believe it. Now certain his sister had been abducted, he expanded his investigation. He used his connections, hiring more private detectives from Nashville, men with no ties to Fairmont politics, who could not be silenced with bribes or intimidated by local overseers. Their mission was simple: follow the Hargrove trail wherever it led. Those detectives began their work in the winter of 1000, 853, and what they uncovered stripped away the veneer of respectability. They traced the overseers, Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, each with a shadowy past, each tied to river trade and shipping companies notorious for discreet cargo in Georgia and Alabama. They found records of boats moving from the Blackwater River to Mobile Bay at regular, eerily calculated intervals. They found connections to merchants in New Orleans and Havana who were known to trade in human beings. Piece by piece, the pattern formed, not a curse of fragile brides, but a deliberate system of abduction and transport disguised as marriage. In Fairmont, the silence held. But outside the county, forces were stirring. William Weaver was not a man to be ignored, and his connections ran far beyond what the Hargroves could reach. When federal officials in Nashville began receiving inquiries backed by pressure from a reputable Charleston lawyer, the matter could no longer be brushed aside. For the first time in over a decade, the walls of the Hargrove Manor trembled, not from the cries in its cellar, but from the weight of attention it could not deflect. The winter of 1853 crept into Fairmont County with a bitter wind that rattled the shutters of farmhouses and stripped the fields bare. But behind the stillness, something new was stirring. For the first time in nearly a decade and a half of vanishing brides, men were asking questions that could not be silenced with forged letters or whispered excuses. Those men were the investigators hired by William Weaver. They arrived quietly, their presence unannounced, their purpose hidden behind the cover of merchants surveying trade routes. But they were not merchants. They were private detectives from Savannah and Nashville, accustomed to digging in the dark places that respectable society preferred to ignore. Their mission was simple in its wording, but dangerous in its execution. Find out what happened to Charlotte Weaver. They started where the trail should have been clearest: the marriage records. The churches in Charleston had nothing. No ledger recorded Charlotte's marriage to Ezra Hargrove, the minister said to have officiated, named in Jeremiah Hargrove's forged letter, was a ghost. From Charleston, they followed the thread to Fairmont. Here, merchants recalled shipments, but never of brides. The manifests were vague, always listing household goods or farm supplies, yet the payments to the riverboat captains were suspiciously large, sums that far outstripped the cargo described. One captain, coaxed with money and protection, finally admitted the truth. He had been hired by the Hargroves multiple times, each time under cover of darkness. Each time his boat carried not crates of cotton, but human-shaped bundles, bound and silent. The Hargrove overseers had loaded them with practiced efficiency, warning the crew to look straight ahead and keep their mouths shut. I heard one cry out once. The captain confessed, faint, like a girl muffled under cloth. Boone gave us a look, his hand on his dagger. After that, none of us said a word. We were paid too well to ask questions. The detectives pushed further, tracing the overseers themselves. Amos Tate, they discovered, had once worked the rivers near Mobile, a man loosely connected to shipping companies accused of smuggling. His name appeared in an old court filing. Charges of illegal transport had been mysteriously dropped. Virgil Boone, stocky and brutal, had worked for a Georgia freighting firm notorious for carrying undocumented cargo. He had vanished from the records as suddenly as he had appeared in Fairmont. To the investigators, it was clear these overseers were no farmhands. They were logisticians in a network that moved people. In Fairmont itself, the suspicion was harder to prove. The Hargrove Manor remained closed, its walls high, its gates bolted, but the detectives spoke quietly with townspeople, merchants, farmers, even enslaved people who risked punishment to whisper the truth. The stories matched too perfectly to be coincidence. Lanterns moving in the night, wagons arriving heavy, leaving light, boats slipping downriver without cargo, but returning with coin, and always the cries, faint, muffled, carried on the wind across the fields. The most damning testimony came from Jacob, the enslaved man once hired to work at the manor. He recounted the construction of the underground cellar beneath the warehouse. He described the chains fixed to the walls, the drainage grooves cut into the stone, the iron doors thick as a jailhouse gate. It wasn't for tools, he said. It was for people. The detectives compiled their findings into a report that William Weaver read with cold determination. For the first time, the Hargrove pattern was not rumor or suspicion. It was documented fact. A decade-long trail of vanished brides, forged records, corrupt overseers, and boats bound for southern ports. Weaver wasted no time. He took the report to his contacts in Nashville, men of influence in federal channels. He knew Fairmont's local sheriff could not be trusted. If justice was to come, it had to come from outside the county's borders. And so, discreetly, petitions were drafted. Warrants were drawn up, not by county clerks, but by federal marshals. For the first time in years, the Hargrove name faced a scrutiny it could not easily evade. But inside Fairmont, the silence held. The townspeople continued their uneasy routines, speaking only in half-sentences about the manor on the hill. Dr. Samuel Vance wrote in his notebook, "Something is moving now. I hear of strange men, merchants they say, but I do not think so. I pray they will see what we could not, for if they fail, the cries from that house will never end." And in her diary, Hannah Gray recorded a night in November 1853, more wagons, more voices from underground. I fear they are not just brides, but many. I count the lanterns, 7, perhaps more, moving back and forth as if a whole family labors underground. And I wonder, how much longer until the earth gives up its secrets? The secrets were closer to being revealed than Hannah could know. For even as she wrote those lines, federal warrants were being signed. Marshals were gathering. The time for whispers was ending, and the Hargroves, confident in their isolation, continued their terrible work, unaware that the eye of the law was finally turning toward them. By early November 1853, the reports compiled by William Weaver's investigators had reached the desks of federal officials in Nashville. For nearly a decade and a half, the whispers about the Hargroves had drifted through Fairmont County like smoke, impossible to grasp. But now there was substance, forged letters, testimony from riverboat captains, evidence of an underground cellar built not for storage, but for confinement. For the first time, the federal government could not look away. Warrants were drafted in secret. They bore the signatures of U.S. Marshals and the seals of judges outside of Fairmont's reach. To ensure surprise, the Marshals coordinated quietly, informing only a trusted few in Nashville and Charleston. The plan was audacious: to raid the Hargrove Manor on the very night a shipment was scheduled to leave. By capturing not only the family and their overseers, but also the boats and buyers, they could unravel the larger network that spread beyond the county's borders. The key was timing. Weaver's detectives, still posing as merchants, had carefully monitored the river traffic. Boats departed from the Hargrove dock with an unsettling regularity, their schedules coinciding with moonless nights when the water was safest for stealth. Through bribed informants along the river, the investigators learned that another vessel was due on November 12th, bound south for Mobile Bay. That date became the fulcrum for the entire operation. In Nashville, the marshals gathered their men, 15 inches all, armed with rifles and pistols, hardened by years of hunting fugitives and smugglers. They moved quietly, some disguised as laborers, others as merchants, converging on Fairmont in small groups so as not to raise alarm. William Weaver himself remained nearby. Though not directly involved in the raid, his influence had ensured the operation moved forward, despite political hesitation. "If we fail," he told Marshal John Carver, who led the raid, "they will disappear again, and no law will be able to touch them. We must strike while their boat is waiting at the dock." Meanwhile, in Fairmont, the Hargroves continued their work, oblivious. Ezra still maintained the appearance of a grieving husband, though no grave had yet been marked for Charlotte Weaver. Gideon and Caleb spoke of new prospects, new brides, as if death left no scars on them. Jeremiah, the patriarch, still walked the fields each morning, his figure rigid in the mist. The overseers, however, were restless. Amos Tate, with the keen eyes of a riverman, seemed more vigilant than usual. Virgil Boone's stocky form often lurked by the gate, his hand never far from his dagger. Perhaps they sensed something was changing, though whether it was suspicion from the town or the weight of their own consciences, no one could say. On the night of November 11th, the lanterns flared up at the warehouse once more. Hannah Gray, from her ridge, described a fever of activity unlike any before. Wagons, shadows, men moving as if on command. She wrote that she saw barrels being rolled toward the cellar, boxes lowered on ropes, and, most horrifyingly, the pale form of a young woman stumbling between two overseers, her head lolling as if drugged. "It is not the first," Hannah wrote. but perhaps it will be the last, if God is merciful. The marshals had their plan. At dusk on the 12th, they gathered in a thicket a few miles from the manor. Horses were tied, rifles checked, lanterns extinguished. They would strike at midnight when the riverboat was expected to arrive. Marshal John Carver, a stern, no-nonsense man, spoke plainly to his men. These are not simple criminals. They are part of something bigger, more ruthless than most of us have seen. We will find captives, we may find records, and we will meet resistance. Do not falter. Tonight we bring the Hargroves into the light. Meanwhile, downriver, the boat was approaching. Its crew spoke in low voices, their lanterns shielded. They moored at the Hargrove dock, met by Amos Tate and Virgil Boone. Covered wagons rumbled down the slope, their wheels groaning under hidden burdens. From inside the cellar came muffled sounds, quickly silenced. The system was at work, practiced after years of refinement, but this time the silence would not hold. Just before midnight, as Boone was leading another wagon toward the dock, the stillness of the woods was broken. The marshals burst from the tree line, rifles leveled, voices commanding, "Federal law, drop your weapons." Panic erupted at the dock. Boone spun, drawing his dagger. Tate shouted orders to the boat crew. A grinding noise came from the cellar as the doors began to be bolted. Lanterns fell, flames licking at the night as men scrambled. The Hargrove family, roused from the house, emerged in confusion. Jeremiah, demanding to know by what authority anyone dared trespass on his land. But the marshals were already advancing, rifles glinting in the lamplight, warrants in hand. What they would discover in the cellar beneath the warehouse was worse than even the most suspicious neighbor had dared to imagine. The marshals' shouts shattered the midnight silence of the Blackwater River. Horses reared, lanterns swung, and the water reflected the firelight as chaos spread across the Hargrove dock. For nearly a decade and a half, the family had conducted its work under a cloak of secrecy. Now, in a single moment, that cloak was torn away. Virgil Boone was the first to act. He lunged at the marshals, dagger in hand. A rifle shot rang out, and he fell, wounded but alive, cursing as two officers wrestled him into irons. On the dock, Amos Tate roared commands at the boat crew, urging them to cut the lines and push off. But before they could shove away, the marshals were upon them, pistols drawn. Tate fought like a cornered man, grappling with two officers until the butt of a rifle knocked him unconscious. From the house above, the Hargrove brothers emerged. Gideon, Caleb, and Ezra, their faces pale, their voices high with outrage. "By what right do you invade our land?" Gideon demanded. His protest carried the tone of a man accustomed to respect. But the warrants, read aloud by Marshal John Carver, cut through his bluster. "By authority of the United States of America, in the matter of kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy, Jeremiah Hargrove, Gideon, Caleb, Ezra, you are under arrest." The patriarch, Jeremiah Hargrove, descended last. His face was a mask of stone, his voice calm, but his hand trembled as he gripped the railing. "This is an outrage," he snarled. "You do not know what you are meddling in." Carver stared him down. "We know enough. Open the cellar." The heavy oak doors groaned as they were forced open. The marshals, lanterns in hand, descended into the darkness. The air was damp, thick with the smell of mildew, and something worse, the smell of people. The lamplight illuminated stone walls fitted with chains. Iron rings were bolted deep. The floor sloped toward drainage grooves where stagnant water pooled. Wooden partitions divided the space into cells large enough for several people at a time. And in those cells, the marshals found what Fairmont had whispered about for years. 4 young women, frail and trembling, their eyes vacant, their limbs unsteady. They shrank from the lanterns, blinking as if blinded, and moaned at the sound of strange voices. Their wrists bore the raw marks of iron, their breath the faint scent of laudanum. "Dear God," one marshal whispered. "It's true." The women were gently led from the cellar, wrapped in blankets, their sobs echoing in the cold night. Some clung to their rescuers as if to life rafts, while others stared into space, too broken to comprehend their release. A search of the cellar revealed more than captives. In a locked chest, the marshals discovered the ledgers. Page after page was a catalogue of human lives reduced to transactions, names, ages, physical descriptions, dates of arrival, notes on destinations, Mobile, New Orleans. Havana with prices neatly written in the margins. Alongside the ledgers were bundles of belongings, carefully folded dresses, ribbons, lockets, locks of hair tied with string, each tagged with a name, each a relic of a woman whose fate had been carried away by the river. The evidence was undeniable. Above ground, the scene was grim. The Hargrove brothers stood in chains, their faces pale but defiant. Jeremiah glared at the marshals with a look not of shame but of rage that his secret world had been exposed. "You will never understand," he hissed at Carver. "We are part of something bigger than this county, bigger than you. Take us down, and the trade continues elsewhere." Carver said nothing. He simply motioned for his men to secure the prisoners. The boat crew was also taken into custody. Foreign men who spoke little English, their accents thick with the cadence of the Caribbean. In their vessel's hold, the marshals discovered compartments built beneath the floorboards, narrow spaces lined with straw, fitted with crude ventilation tubes, a human cargo hold designed for silence and concealment. By dawn, the townspeople awoke to the sight of wagons leaving the Hargrove Manor, wagons carrying not cotton, but prisoners in chains. The news spread like wildfire. The brides had not died, they had been taken. Hannah Gray, upon hearing the news, wrote simply, "At last, the cries from underground have been heard. May God grant peace to the living and rest to those the river took." Dr. Samuel Vance, though shocked, assisted the marshals in caring for the rescued women. He documented their symptoms with professional care, noting the lingering effects of the drugs. In his notebook, he added, "No fever, no weakness, only poison and confinement." The truth at last. The arrests marked the end of the Hargrove family's veil of secrecy. Within hours, Jeremiah and his sons were on their way to the county jail under federal guard. Tate and Boone followed, their heads bowed, their futures sealed. But though the raid had revealed horrors beyond imagining, it was only the beginning. For what the marshals carried out of that cellar, the ledgers, the letters, the shipping records pointed to something much larger than Fairmont County, a network of buyers and sellers that stretched across states, even across oceans. The Hargroves were not an isolated family of predators. They were one link in a chain that bound the vulnerable to the ruthless, and untangling that chain would prove far more difficult than breaking down a cellar door. The raid on the Hargrove Manor sent a shockwave through Fairmont County and beyond. For years, neighbors had whispered their suspicions, but most had convinced themselves the truth could not be as dark as the rumors. Now, with captives pulled from the cellar, ledgers in hand, and the family itself in chains, the truth was undeniable. But discovering a crime is one thing. Bringing its perpetrators to justice is another. The trial of Jeremiah Hargrove, his 3 sons, and the 2 overseers began in the spring of 1854, held not in Fairmont itself, but in Nashville under federal jurisdiction. The courtroom was packed from the first day. Journalists from across the South crowded alongside local farmers, ministers, and the families of missing daughters who had long feared the worst. The charges were severe: kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and participation in a human trafficking network that crossed state lines. But pointedly, the indictments shied away from the full international scope. Officials feared that implicating foreign buyers or corrupt customs officials would destabilize trade and embarrass influential men. And so the charges were framed narrowly, enough to convict the Hargroves, but not enough to expose every hand that had profited. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The ledgers with their columns of names, ages, and prices in Jeremiah's own hand. The personal belongings of dozens of women dresses, jewelry, locks of hair collected like trophies in the cellar. Testimony from the rescued captives who spoke in weak, trembling voices as they described being drugged, chained, and told they were now wives to men they had never truly married. Testimony from riverboat captains who had been bought into silence for years, who now confessed to carrying cargo they knew was human. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Jacob, the escaped slave. Under oath, he described the construction of the cellar, the cries he heard at night, the sight of women being led, drugged and stumbling, to the boats. His words carried a moral weight that no document could match. The 2 overseers, Amos Tate and Virgil Boone, broke first. Under pressure, they confessed their roles, driving the carriages, guarding the captives, arranging the transfers at the dock. They spoke of Jeremiah as the architect, the sons as the recruiters, themselves as the enforcers. In exchange for leniency, they revealed details of the larger network, names of buyers in New Orleans, contacts in Mobile, whispers of connections that reached as far as Havana. Yet much of this testimony was quietly set aside. Officials feared implicating powerful merchants, ship owners, even foreign consuls. Instead, the focus remained squarely on the Hargrove family and their immediate circle. Public outrage swelled as the trial progressed. How could men of such wealth and standing, men who had sat in church pews every Sunday, who had donated to schools and roads, have committed such atrocities? Yet the evidence was there, undeniable. The prosecution painted the Hargroves as predators cloaked in respectability. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to cast the evidence as exaggeration, the overseer's confessions as self-serving lies. Jeremiah Hargrove maintained a cold composure throughout the trial, insisting the charges were fabrications motivated by envy of his family's wealth. His sons followed his lead, their faces pale but defiant. But the ledgers could not be denied. The cellar could not be explained away. The rescued women trembling on the stand could not be silenced. In the summer of 1854, the verdicts were delivered. The courtroom was so full that onlookers spilled out into the street. Jeremiah Hargrove, guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping and conspiracy. Gideon, Caleb, and Ezra, guilty of complicity. Tate and Boone, guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in shock. But the greatest shock was yet to come. The sentences. Despite the gravity of the crimes, the Hargroves received relatively lenient sentences. Jeremiah and his two elder sons were sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary. Ezra, the youngest, received just 8 years. The two overseers, by contrast, lacking wealth or influence, were sentenced to 20 years, to be served in harsher conditions. The imbalance was stark. The wealthy family, whose name had long shielded them, had been spared the full weight of justice, while their hired hands bore the heavier penalties. The newspapers erupted in controversy. A Nashville paper condemned the leniency. If the crimes of the Hargroves do not merit the severest punishment, then what crimes will? Another in Charleston, by contrast, suggested caution. The sins of individuals must not be allowed to tarnish the reputation of legitimate commerce. In Fairmont County, the families of the missing wept in anger. Their daughters had been listed like cattle, sold into foreign horrors, yet the men responsible would live to see freedom again. Hannah Gray recorded in her diary, "Justice is only half served. They are guilty, yes, but the punishment does not match the cries I heard for so many years. I fear the truth has been trimmed to shield the powerful." Dr. Samuel Vance, though vindicated in his suspicions, shared a similar bitterness. The Hargroves will live out their days behind walls, but the women they destroyed, who will speak for them? Too many are gone forever. Too many graves are unmarked. The two overseers did not last long. Within a few years, both were dead in prison of illness. Some whispered they had been deliberately silenced, lest they reveal more about the network's reach. The Hargroves, meanwhile, endured their sentences in relative comfort. Jeremiah himself died in prison after only 7 years. His sons served between 5 and 10 years, each eventually released into obscurity. The public never learned the full extent of their operation. The ledgers seized from the cellar hinted at many more victims, names never traced, destinations never confirmed. Historians now believe the more than 40 documented brides may be only a fraction of the true number. In the end, the trial brought neither full justice nor full truth. It confirmed years of suspicion, punished the guilty partially, but left the deeper questions unanswered. Who else had profited? How many officials had looked the other way? How many women had vanished irretrievably, lost in Havana, New Orleans, or ports even farther away? The Hargrove case closed in Nashville, but its echoes never left Fairmont. The family name was scrubbed from county records, their manor seized and later abandoned. Yet the scars remained, etched in the diaries of Hannah Gray, the notebooks of Dr. Vance, and the memories of families who never saw their daughters again. When the trial concluded in the summer of 1854, the Hargrove name was disgraced, their manor seized, their patriarch and sons sent to prison. For the families of the missing, however, the verdict brought little comfort. A sentence could not bring back a daughter, nor could it heal the lives shattered by their absence. The ledgers seized from the cellar listed over 40 names. Only 4 women had been rescued in the raid. That left nearly 40 whose fates remained unknown. The 4 survivors were shadows of their former selves. One, a girl of just 17, wept uncontrollably when asked her name. She could not remember it, or perhaps she dared not speak it. Another stared at the walls, her eyes vacant, her body trembling whenever a man entered the room. A third clung to the doctor who cared for her, begging not to be left alone. "Doctor," Samuel Vance wrote in his notes, "they have been drugged for weeks, perhaps months. Laudanum, opium, other compounds I cannot identify. Their bodies are weak, their minds clouded. I do not know if they will ever fully recover. Despite care and time, only 2 eventually regained enough strength to speak of their captivity. They described being told they were now wives, then being locked in the cellar. They were fed mixtures that kept them sleepy and docile. They recalled being dressed in simple shifts, stripped of the clothes they had arrived in, and they remembered the sound of the boats, the rough hands that carried other women away under cover of darkness. For the families of the missing, the revelations were devastating. In Natchez, relatives of Mary Caldwell wept to learn her name appeared in the ledgers. For years, they had believed she died of a fever. Now they knew she had been taken, sold like a commodity. In Savannah, distant kin of Laura Bennett demanded answers that would never come. No grave was found, no remains were recovered. Her name, too, was listed with a price beside it, proof she had been sold and shipped away, her final destination unknown. And in Charleston, William Weaver, though vindicated in his suspicions, was shattered by the confirmation that his sister, Charlotte, had indeed been processed through the Hargrove system. Her name was recorded clearly, with the chilling annotation, Havana, $500. William Weaver wrote in his memoirs, "She had written me letters full of dreams of a husband, a home, a family. I thought she had found salvation. Instead, she found shackles. I will never forgive myself for not reaching her sooner." The psychological toll on the rescued women was immense. Though they had escaped being shipped away, they could not escape the memories. Most lived out the rest of their lives in seclusion, unwilling to marry, fearful of strangers, haunted by nightmares. Only one eventually married, but her letters decades later spoke of nights she woke up screaming, believing she was back in the cellar. The wider community bore its own scars. The families who had once gossiped about the Hargroves now shuddered at their own silence. They had suspected, whispered, even joked about the illness that afflicted the Hargrove brides. Yet no one had acted until it was too late. Hannah Gray, whose diary had chronicled the events more faithfully than any official record, wrote in one of her final entries, "I am haunted not only by the cries I heard, but by the silence I kept. Had I spoken louder, would anyone have listened? Or would I too have been silenced? My pen was my voice, but it saved no one." The federal investigation that followed the trial tried in vain to trace the missing. Agents traveled to New Orleans, Mobile, and Havana. They carried lists of names and descriptions. A few scattered reports emerged. An American woman seen in a household in Cuba, another rumored to have died in childbirth on a Caribbean plantation. But there were no records, no proof, and most trails ran cold. The matter was further complicated by the corruption of shipping manifests. Captains had been bribed to record the women as passengers under false names. Once they stepped off a ship in another country, they were lost in a maze of aliases and forged papers. Some historians now believe many of the women did not survive the voyages. Drugged, weakened, and held in airless compartments, some likely died before reaching their destinations. Their bodies, unrecorded, would have been cast into the sea. For the families left behind, closure never came. Instead, they were left with the bitter knowledge that their daughters, sisters, and nieces had been reduced to entries in a ledger, valued in dollars. The reparations promised by the state after the trial rarely materialized. The true legacy of the Hargrove crimes was grief. Grief etched in journals, whispered by gravesides, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. In time, the ruins of the Hargrove Manor would stand as a reminder of what happened. But for those who lived through the years of disappearance, the memory never faded. More than 40 women had entered the Hargrove Manor. Only 4 walked out alive. After the verdicts were read, and the Hargrove men were led away in chains, their manor became the subject of intense debate. Some argued it should be preserved as a monument to the evidence. Others wanted it razed to the ground. In the end, the decision was more practical than moral. The Hargrove Manor was seized by the state, its assets to be auctioned with the promise that the proceeds would go to compensate the families of the missing. But, like so much else in this story, the promise turned hollow. The fertile land along the Blackwater River was quickly sold to speculators. The house itself, however, proved far less appealing. Word of the seller spread quickly, and many would-be visitors refused to even enter the riverside warehouse. One buyer who walked through the stone house's corridors only to leave pale and trembling, muttering that the walls seemed to echo with voices. Another, who was inspecting the cellar with a lantern, fled after a few minutes, convinced he had heard sobbing that no one else could hear. Eventually, the new owners gave up any attempt to live in the house. They rented out the farmland, but left the manor sealed, its windows boarded, its doors locked. The cellar was sealed with iron bolts, though county children whispered that if you put your ear to the stone, you could still hear faint cries. When the Civil War erupted in the 1860 seconds, Fairmont lay directly in the path of destruction. Union troops swept through the county. The Hargrove Manor, already derelict, was burned to the ground. The granite walls cracked in the heat. The beams collapsed. The once fortress-like house was reduced to a blackened ruin. Soldiers who pried open the cellar found it empty, but still fitted with its chains and drains. Records note that even men hardened by battle shuddered at what they saw there. Before leaving, they sealed the cellar with explosives, collapsing much of the chamber in on itself. By the end of the war, the manor was nothing but a ruin. Vines covered the walls, the Blackwater River flooded the docks, and the Great Drive, where the carriages once rolled, turned to mud and silence. Still, the memory of the Hargroves remained. Farmers spoke of hearing footsteps on misty mornings near the burned-out foundation. Children dared each other to creep near the ruins, only to flee at the first rustle of leaves. Superstition or not, the ruins became a place shunned by locals. They called it the Silent Acreage. No family ever settled there again. The matter of compensating the victims' families quickly dissolved in bureaucracy. The state claimed the funds from the land sale had been lost in the wartime disruptions. In the end, only a fraction was ever paid out, and even then the sums were paltry. For most, there was no justice. Only a lifetime of wondering what had become of their daughters, sisters, and wives. Historians who visited the site in the decades that followed found scattered fragments in the soil, rusted iron shackles, shards of glass, buttons from dresses long since rotted away. In 1879, the chest full of ledgers and letters was found in an old town warehouse, reigniting the local stories once more and confirming the true scale of the crimes. By the 20th century, only a low foundation remained hidden beneath wild vegetation. The name Hargrove had been erased from Fairmont County's official records. No gravestone bore its name, but in folklore, the memory survived. Old women told their granddaughters to beware of gentlemen from nowhere with promises of marriage, and through it all, the number over 40 remained like a curse. Over 40 brides had entered the manor, 4 had left alive, the rest taken by the river and the sea. In this way, the Hargrove Manor passed into legend. Some spoke of it as a haunting, others as a morality tale. But for those who studied the ledgers, the cellar, and the testimonies, it was neither a ghost story nor a fable. It was the truth, a system of exploitation, hidden in plain sight, enabled by silence, shielded by wealth, and ended only when one mistake brought it into the light. For more than a century after the Civil War, the ruins of the Hargrove Manor lay buried under vines and silence. Locals called it the Silent Acreage, a place best avoided. The stones of the house sank into the earth. The cellar collapsed. The dock rotted into the Blackwater River. Most who passed by saw only a tangle of trees, unaware of the history beneath their feet. By the mid-20th century, the memory of the Hargroves had faded to whispers and half-remembered stories. Old men spoke of the brides who disappeared. Children dared each other to wander near the ruins, but the details had blurred, the facts lost to rumor. That changed in 1879. In October of that year, workmen repairing the old town warehouse stumbled upon a locked chest. It was battered, its iron fittings rusted, but inside was a collection of carefully sealed documents. The discovery seemed at first unremarkable, just another forgotten relic of the 19th century. But when historians examined the contents, they realized they had uncovered the lost heart of the Hargrove story. Inside were the ledgers and letters that had been seized in the 1853 raid, long thought to be lost. There were Jeremiah Hargrove's handwritten records listing names, ages, origins, destinations. There were receipts for payments, correspondence from buyers in Havana, merchants in New Orleans, middlemen in Mobile, and there were personal items, knots of hair, ribbons, fragments of dresses kept as proof of delivery, grim keepsakes preserved for bookkeeping. Each item matched an entry in a ledger, a name crossed out with a price beside it. The chest forced the story into the light once more. Historians pored over the documents, piecing together what the 1,854 trial had glossed over. They saw clearly what federal authorities had been reluctant to admit at the time. The Hargroves were not a rogue family acting alone. They were part of a larger human trafficking network that spanned states and seas, one link in a chain that profited from the sale of human beings under the guise of marriage. The documents suggested the true number of victims may have been much higher. The figure of over 40 brides, long repeated in Fairmont folklore, was only the provable portion. The rediscovery of the chest sparked a new wave of outrage. Newspapers across Tennessee ran stories under headlines like "The Forgotten Brides of Fairmont" and "The Ledger of Chains Unearthed." Families descended from the victims came forward, some with old letters, others with only handed-down memories. Many wept to see their ancestors' names written coldly in Jeremiah Hargrove's hand. In 1880, a memorial service was held in Fairmont. Descendants gathered near the overgrown ruins where a simple stone plaque was placed. It bore no names, only an inscription. In memory of the women who were deceived by the promise of love, but found chains. Still, the questions remained. How many officials had known and chosen silence? How many merchants had profited? Why were the Hargrove sons, released after their light sentences, never prosecuted for the greater crimes the documents revealed? Some historians conclude the suppression of the truth had been deliberate, a concerted effort to shield powerful men in New Orleans, Mobile, and Havana from exposure. The Hargroves, though disgraced, had served as scapegoats, their punishment limited to contain the larger scandal. For Fairmont County, the legacy was heavy. The silent acreage remained untouched, but visitors began to come, journalists, historians, even descendants of the lost. They walked among the vines, searching for traces of the cellar. Some swore they could still hear faint cries when the wind blew off the river. Others found only silence, broken by the sound of flowing water. Hannah Gray's diary, preserved by her family, and Dr. Samuel Vance's notebooks were published together in later years. They became essential sources for understanding not just the facts, but the human cost, the fear, the silence, the price of inaction. The story of the Hargroves endures because it is more than a tale of one family's cruelty. It is a lesson in how evil can thrive under the veneer of respectability, how silence can become complicity, and how the institutions meant to protect the vulnerable can fail in the face of wealth and influence. More than 40 women walked through the gates of the Hargrove Manor between 1838 and 1854. Only 4 were rescued. The rest were lost to the sea and the markets, their lives reduced to ink and numbers in a ledger. Their absence echoes louder than any ghost story. Today, the ruins of the Hargrove Manor remain hidden in the overgrown vegetation along the Blackwater River. The stones have cracked, the cellar has collapsed, but the memory remains. Every whisper of wind through those trees is a reminder. Once, in this place, love was promised and lives were stolen. And the lesson is clear. Evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it kneels in the front pew at church, donates to the schools, shakes your hand at the market. Sometimes it hides behind a family name, smiling all the while it forges its chains. The Hargrove Manor is gone, but its story endures, a warning etched into history that silence is the accomplice of cruelty and that vigilance is the only guardian against those who would turn trust into betrayal.